All right. Well, good morning again. So Ecclesiastes, boy, this is a book that is perhaps one of the most confusing books in the entire Bible. In fact, from its authorship to its purpose to its tone, Ecclesiastes is a book that has forever confused commentators. Commentators don't even agree on what the purpose of the book is, or even who wrote the book. So some commentators, for example, believe that Ecclesiastes was written by Solomon for the simple fact that that's what the book says. But other commentators believe it was written by 2, 3, or even 9 different authors who gave credit to Solomon as a sort of literary tactic for one who was at the time the personification of wisdom. Those who believe that Solomon was the author believe that he reached the end of his life and was reflecting in sort of a diary sort of way. He was reflecting the futility of all he had experienced. Others believe that the author was Solomon, but that he is role-playing in this book by casting himself as a secularist. So he presents the claims of a secularist and then discusses them and refutes them. And so as a result, some have characterized this book with adjectives such as fatalistic, pessimistic, skeptical, and even nihilistic. For others, Ecclesiastes records the experiences of a man of faith who had allowed himself to desire everything life had to offer, even to the point of becoming addicted to those experiences, and in the book voices a relentlessly realistic conclusion to the futility of such a way of life. Right? So it benefits nothing, all is vanity. And then still others believe that Ecclesiastes records life from the perspective of someone who does not yet know the plan of salvation which Jesus would ultimately come to enact. And from that unarrived perspective, all does seem futile. So Ecclesiastes is a difficult book to understand. Now, but for all those unknowns, there's much that we can know, we can learn from the book. The book gets its title from chapter 1, verse 1. It says, "The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem." Your version may say teacher. The English designation Ecclesiastes is derived from the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. Okay? And so the Hebrew word behind the Greek is the word Koheleth. Probably pronouncing that wrong. Koheleth, or Ecclesiastes in English, can be translated to mean preacher, speaker, philosopher, or teacher. The name refers to one who gathers people so as to instruct them. And so some commentators believe that teacher would be the better translation over preacher, because the tone of the book is not sermonic in nature. Okay? In other words, if a preacher's job is to give answers and to communicate truth, then the author of Ecclesiastes is a pretty bad job, because he doesn't have any answers. He just asks questions. This preacher has no real answers, but only questions and observations. And so this preacher very much takes on the role of a teacher whose primary method for instructing is the Socratic method. So what is that? He says, what do people gain from all their labor at which they toil under the sun? So he asks a question, and he follows that question with a number of observations. Generations come, generations go, but the earth remains forever, on and on and on. Makes a statement, follows it with an observation, or states a question. And so he says all that as if to say, what's the point of it all? And so this preacher is more like a teacher or seminar leader who employs the Socratic method of teaching. And so he's most concerned with, if this is his role, then he's most concerned with asking the right questions about life rather than simply giving the right answers to life. Okay? And so in my opinion, this is an outstanding way to teach. So, what if every class you took began with the right questions rather than the right answers? Right? So what if at the beginning of every science class, for example, we asked the right questions? What if instead of just jumping into discovery, we asked, what after all is the purpose of discovery in this world? Where does it lead us? To what end are all our discoveries? Or, what if before we jumped into a work of classical literature in English class, we asked, what purpose after all does literature serve in the life of humanity? Why should we care? What if before we went to work each morning, we asked, what after all is work about? Turn around, yes. Is it just making money? Right? What's the point of it all? And so I think the reality is that we all do ask these questions, but we ask them after the fact. And so actually it may be that you are here this morning because you are turning to religion in your aged years, because you are looking back at your life, having done so much, and now asking, what was all that for? I made money, I experienced good things, I had boats and cars and dirt bikes and vacations, and I went camping, and I went to Disney, and I went to Six Flags. I did everything that my culture told me was important to do, and what was it all for? And so we do ask these questions, but we ask the questions like the preacher asked the question, after the fact, looking back. Right? So the preacher says in chapter 2, verse 4, I undertook great projects. I built houses for myself and planted vineyards. I made gardens and parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made reservoirs of water, water grows of flourishing trees. And then verse 11, yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done, when I looked back at my life and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, chasing after the wind, nothing was gained under the sun. The preacher is looking back and asking, what for? What was the purpose of it all? Okay. So, but what if we asked the questions beforehand? What if we looked forward first and asked, what for? What if we started with the right questions instead of just ending with them? So what if life in Laconia launched out of the right questions? How might that change what we experience and how we experience it in Laconia? What if our young people asked, why do I want to go to college? What's it for? What should an education be about in the world if it's actually going to be meaningful? Right? What if our young professionals asked, why do I want to be an attorney? What should attorney work be about if it were to honor Christ? Or why do I want to be a police officer? What should policing be about in the city of Laconia if it were to be an activity which would honor Christ? What form should it take and what form should it not take? Or, why do I want to be a business owner? What should business be about in our city if it were to be a use of my time that honored and exalted Christ? What sort of business would I start? What sort of business would I not start? Right? I think the fact is that most people do or don't ask deep enough questions of their life prior to beginning their life's work. And so, like the preacher, they get to the end of their lives and they say, what the heck was that all about? Right? This, I believe, is a significant message of Ecclesiastes, that Ecclesiastes leads us to ask the right questions of life before we have, like the preacher, lived life for all the wrong reasons. Okay? Now consider this also. If indeed Solomon wrote Ecclesiastes, and if he's not role-playing, but voicing in a diary sort of way the wrestlings of his own heart as he walks through life, then this impacts how we interpret what we read. So if Solomon is wrestling out loud the frustrations of life in a fallen world, and God has decided to give it to us as inspired scripture, then when we read Ecclesiastes, we're not looking for correct information about life. Don't you hear me? Instead, we are looking for something about the experience of life and not life itself. So think about it this way. If you were in the habit of journaling on a daily basis, it's safe to say that there would be some journal days for which your thoughts seemed illogical and over the top. Would you agree? Have you ever had one of those days where you said, I hate this life. I wish everyone would just go away and never come back. That's the only way I could be happy. Right? Well, yeah, you've had a day like that. Well, if your 12-year-old picked up your journal entry that day and read it, would it make sense for your child to conclude, well, Mom says the only way to be happy in this life is to live by herself, so I think I'll never marry and have children? No. Right? Should that be what he learns from your journal? No. You weren't giving him correct information about life when you wrote that day's journal entry. Instead, you were giving him correct information about your experience of life, and in that way, everything you said is absolutely true. Basically, what you said was, some days the experience of life is so difficult that I wish I lived on an island by myself somewhere, and that is an absolutely true statement. Sometimes life is that difficult. Okay? But that is not the same as saying that the only way to happiness is on an island. In this way, everything we read in Ecclesiastes is true. It is inspired of God, but it is true of mankind's experience of life, even if it's not true of life itself. Does that make sense? So, for example, when the preacher says, utterly meaningless, everything is meaningless, that is an absolutely true statement about our experience of life, but it is not an absolutely true statement about life itself. Life absolutely feels meaningless and utterly meaningless some days, but that is different than saying that life is actually, in truth, meaningless. So this is part of the difficulty of reading Ecclesiastes. The preacher is not telling us what life is like. The preacher is telling us what the experience of life is like. And in that way, there is not one untrue statement in the entire book. This does not mean that there are not true statements in Ecclesiastes. I'm simply saying that the author is more concerned with communicating mankind's experience of life than truth about life itself. So there's probably a ton more that we could say as an intro to this series. But let's get into our passage today, our passages. I want us to see 5 things. I want us to see the difficulty of life for all, the poverty of humanism, the poverty of hedonism, the poverty of existentialism, and the riches of life under the sun. I want to look at those 5 things this morning. I remember when I was about 11 years old, my family and I made a visit to my uncle's house, where he showed us how he made stained glass lanterns. He's good at it too, and we went down into his basement, his workshop there, and he showed us how he took pieces of stained glass and he cut them into various shapes and sizes, and they were different colors. And he showed us how he built lamps and figurines out of it. And this visit was at a time in my life when I was quickly becoming aware of just how difficult and unfair and scary a world we lived in. So I was being picked on in school. Okay. Fear was a strong daily experience for me. I longed to go to a different school or be homeschooled, but at the time it just wasn't an option. And so I remember going home that day after this visit with my uncle, and I remember actually being in the bathroom, looking out the window, saying to myself, I want to go live with my uncle. I wanted to live there and build stained glass lamps in his basement. And that sounds weird, okay? But the reason I felt that way was because while down in his workshop, I felt safe and purposeful. The world was outside and upstairs, and therefore is far, far away to me. Okay? Working with my hands took my mind off my fears. An added feature of the comfort I felt in the basement was my uncle's wood-burning stove in a basement full of wood, which gave me the illusion that I might never have to leave the basement. And I'd be warm, right? At the time, I was longing for a place of complete safety where life was not hard. And it was not until many years later that I realized that life was hard and scary for everyone, not just me. The preacher's opening words in chapter 1 voice the difficulty of life under the sun, a difficulty that is experienced by everyone. Okay? Everyone experiences life as difficult. He says in Ecclesiastes 1:8, all things are wearisome, more than one can say. The eye never has enough of seeing, nor the ear is full of hearing. What has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. And if you jump down to verse 13, he says, I applied my mind to study and explore by wisdom all that is done under the heavens. What a heavy burden he has laid on mankind. If Solomon wrote these words, then this is a very peculiar observation. Because Solomon was the richest, most powerful man in the world at the time. We feel like saying to him, what do you know about difficulty? Huh? You've never wanted for anything your entire life. But the preacher's right, isn't he? Whether you are rich or poor, the experience of life for everyone is one of great difficulty. We may have different difficulties, but nonetheless, the experience is difficult for everyone. So it's probably true for most of us that our lives, physically speaking, have fared leaps and bounds over the physical well-being of people in third world countries. Is that a fair statement? Most of us have never known what it is to be truly hungry. Most of us have never seen war up close. Most of us have never been violently persecuted for our faith. But still, this world has not been easy for us. Dr. Robert Rayburn, a well-known pastor for over 35 years, a man who also has never truly had want, he once said, it's been sometimes for me real bitterness to observe a world in which evil is called good, in which the most abject foolishness is called wisdom, and in which the devil seems to have his way in making the life difficult, especially for those who wish to live godly lives and serve the Lord. I have seen plenty of the debilitating effects of sin, and the closer I am to those whose lives are blighted by sin, the uglier this world has often seemed to me. But for me, most of all, it is my own moral and spiritual failure, my inexcusable incompetence as a Christian man, in all the various roles of my life, my great failures of omission and commission, disgustingly repeated through the years of my life. It is all the utterly stupid, immoral, ridiculous things I have said or done, the shame I felt in the aftermath, and no burden is heavier than shame. The innumerable ways in which I knew myself to have acted badly. I know all too well what it is to think one's toil is a waste, one's laughter high irony, given everything else that is true of my life and the life of others. I know very well what it is, even to hate my life. I have loved this life and I have hated it. I have enjoyed it and found it disgusting. I have wanted more of it and no more of it. And I think that could be said by any of us. It doesn't matter who you are. Life is not easy for anyone. Even the rich man occasionally, maybe even frequently, desires a warm basement secluded from the world with something useful to do with his hands. Because life is hard. It just is. And so the preacher's experience as king has proven no less toilsome than the peasant's experience as servant. And so he tells us, first of all, that life is difficult for all people. And although life is not truly meaningless, the experience of life, because of its difficulty, so often feels that way. The second thing we see is the poverty of humanism. Now, when our experience of life is wearisome, as it is for all of us, we must find some way to deal with that weariness, some way of making it bearable. Okay? And so the first way common to mankind, which the preacher alludes to, is the way of humanism. And humanism basically calls us to make a difference in the world in our short time here, even though life is hard. It calls us to take this dark and weary world and make it brighter. It calls us to make a difference. But the reckless question that the preacher dares to ask is, do you really think you can make a difference in the world? Verse 11, no one remembers the former generations, and even those yet to come will not be remembered by those who follow them. And then if you were to jump to chapter 6, he would say, a man may have 100 children and live many years, yet no matter how long he lives, if he cannot enjoy his prosperity and does not receive proper burial, I say that a stillborn child is better off than he. It comes without meaning. It departs in darkness, and in darkness its name is shrouded. Though it never saw the sun or knew anything, that is the stillborn child, it has more rest than does this man. Even if he lives 1,000 years twice over, but fails to enjoy his prosperity, do not all go to the same place? That's rather sadistic, isn't it? But is it? Read any philosopher today who dares to be honest about life, and they will tell you that nothing you do will ever really last or be remembered. When I die, I will not be remembered forever. Sure, my children remember me, perhaps many of you remember me, but 100 years from now, hardly anyone will know my name or what my life was like. 1,000 years from now, absolutely nothing of me will remain. And if the world shall continue on for millions of years, as the scientists say it will, then what I do right now makes absolutely no difference whatsoever. So what does it matter if I'm loved or hated in this life? In the end, I won't be remembered for either. Right? The preacher says here that dealing with life's wearisomeness by trying to make a difference in the world is an utter fart. I'm not saying we shouldn't do that, but I'm saying if that's how we're dealing with the weariness of life, nothing you do will be remembered for long after you die, and nothing you do will be of any lasting difference because someone will come along and undo what you did anyway. That's what Solomon will say. Now hang in there, because the Bible always ends with hope, okay? But let's be clear about what the preacher is saying. He's saying, no one remembers the former generations, and even those yet to come will not be remembered by those who follow them. So don't think you can deal with the weariness of life by trying to make a difference. You won't make a difference for long, if we're honest. Humanism is impoverished, says Solomon. And it doesn't deal with the weariness of life. In chapter 2, he goes on to say hedonism is impoverished too. So one way to deal with life's wearisomeness is to try to make a difference with your life. Another way to deal is to forget about making a difference and just focus your attention on getting as much pleasure out of this short life as you possibly can. This is called hedonism. The preacher said, I said to myself, come now, I will test you with pleasure to find out what is good. But that also proved to be meaningless. Laughter, I said, is madness. And what does pleasure accomplish? I tried cheering myself with wine and embraced folly. My mind still guiding me with wisdom, I wanted to see what was good for people to do under the heavens during the few days of their lives. If we jump down to verse 10, he says, I denied myself nothing. I refused my heart no pleasure. And yet, everything was meaningless. A chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained. The preacher says, don't waste your time with hedonism. Been there, done that, got the bumper sticker, and that was meaningless too. Now, anyone who's tried to live life this way knows how meaningless it is. Right? So many people embrace hedonism, for example, through, let's just give an example of consumerism, right? Consumerism, the consumerist always needs the newest things. They're always upgrading. They love leasing their vehicles because every 2 years they get a brand new one. The consumerist is up to date at all times, but the drive is not so much the new stuff as it is for newness itself. When things are new, they have an excitement, do they not? A new dating relationship is exciting. A new car is exciting. A new piece of furniture is exciting. A new cell phone is exciting. But that new car smell always goes away, doesn't it? No matter what you do. No matter how many times you tell the kids, don't you dare bring any food in this car. So long-term relationships are hard for these people. You know why? Because it's hard to keep newness in a relationship. It's not impossible, just hard. But there's a dark side to hedonism that the preacher experienced. The dark side is the fact that the hedonist becomes a slave to his pleasures. Right? So there is no way to refuse to deny yourself your pleasures and not become a slave to your pleasures. If you think you're the exception, you're not thinking. Okay? King Solomon knew this better than anyone. So let me just say, if you're on your fourth marriage right now, because you are still hoping to find meaning through a relationship, Solomon has you way beat. I mean, way beat. I mean, you're like in T-ball. Right? King Solomon proved once and for all that the male sex drive is insatiable if you give into it. King Solomon, this is from 1 Kings, loved many foreign women besides Pharaoh's daughter, Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites. They were from nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, you must not intermarry with them, because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods. Nevertheless, Solomon held fast to them in love. He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, and his wives led him astray. I don't know how this man ever left the bedroom. But I mean, this is what an addiction does to you, right? If you are addicted to something, that something consumes almost all of your waking hours. This is the deception of hedonism. It invites you to quench your thirst with something that will totally dehydrate you and ultimately kill you. So the preacher is right. You will never get rid of life's meaningless experience through hedonism. So he says, first of all, the difficulty of life for all. He talks about the poverty of humanism, the poverty of hedonism. Fourthly, we see the poverty of existentialism. So what is existentialism? Well, existentialism is a philosophy of life in which the individual's starting point is characterized by a sense of disorientation, confusion, or dread in the face of an apparently meaningless or absurd world. So the existentialist believes that every human being must ultimately face the meaninglessness of life and create meaning out of it. The existentialist says life is meaningless, but each individual has a responsibility of finding his own meaning in it. And they call this living authentically. Now, I think it's living hypocritically. If life has no meaning, then live that way. At least be honest, right? The preacher doesn't discuss existentialism as a way to deal with life's meaninglessness. I think he was too honest to try that, so I'm not going to trick myself. But I mention existentialism because it's one way our modern world has chosen to deal with life, to acknowledge life's meaninglessness and then try to create meaning out of it. And again, I think if you adopt this philosophy in order to find meaning in life, you're really just living a lie, not authentically at all. So we see the difficulty of life for everyone, rich, poor, doesn't matter where. It's hard. We see the poverty of humanism, making a difference. We see the poverty of hedonism, giving into your pleasures. Lastly, we see the poverty of existentialism. And lastly, we see, and we'll close with this, we see the riches of life under the sun, S-O-N. The riches of life under the sun. Now, a recurring phrase that we will see a lot in Ecclesiastes is the phrase, under the sun, S-U-N. It actually appears 27 times in the book. So Ecclesiastes 1:3, what do people gain from all their labor at which they toil under the sun? Verse 9, what has been will be again, what has been done will be done again, there is nothing new under the sun. Verse 14, I have seen all the things that are done under the sun, all of them are meaningless. Right? Over and over again, the preacher uses this phrase, under the sun. And some Bible scholars believe, and I tend to agree with them, that Ecclesiastes is sort of a commentary or an expansive meditation on the fall. They believe that Ecclesiastes describes in detail the consequences of life on earth after the fall. Life is hard, life is toilsome, life is meaningless, life is confusing, life is a burden, life was without purpose. Because of the fall, life under the sun has become what God never intended it to be, and unless it can return to its original state under the sun, life will be one long experience of meaninglessness. And I think that's right. If this life is all there is, if the scientists are right that there is no life beyond this life, then not only will our experience of life feel meaningless, life is actually meaningless. If there is no life beyond life under the sun, everything is in truth utterly meaningless, and it is illogical and psychologically deceptive to say it is anything but truly meaningless. Let's not kid ourselves. Let's not try to make up meaning. Let's be honest and call a spade a spade. If there is no other life than this life under the sun, everything is utterly meaningless. You will be forgotten. I will be forgotten. The world will blow up. All will be for nothing. But what if life under the sun is not the only life there is? What if this life under the sun is really just a foretaste of life under the true sun one day? Well, that's exactly what the Bible teaches. The Bible teaches us that because of the fall, everyone experiences this life as burdensome and toilsome. But then it tells us that life under Jesus Christ, the true Son, is whole and complete and meaningful again. The Bible tells us that God saw what we did, not they, but we, to his perfect world, how we made it burdensome and toilsome and meaningless because of our sin. But in his great love for us, God entered the world we broke in the person of Jesus Christ and reversed its curse. The Bible tells us that Jesus Christ, the one and only Superman, entered our world to save it. And while on the cross saving the world, the most absurd thing happened. The watching world looked at the cross and thought Jesus died meaninglessly. They thought it was all for naught. They thought it was wasted. They thought his life was now good for nothing. But on the cross is where Jesus made everything new. On the cross, death got reversed. On the cross, God's purpose for mankind was restored. On the cross, our burdens and weariness were swallowed up in a hope that now, because of Jesus' sacrifice, we shall inherit a new heaven and a new earth, where one day the Son, that is Jesus Christ, will never set again. There will be no night. There will be no toil. There will be no pain. And nothing in this life will prove to be meaningless after all. For in truth, if you are a Christian today, then everything you do under the sun in this life, if you do it for Jesus, and to Jesus, and through Jesus, and by Jesus, and because of Jesus, and to the praise and glory of Jesus, and all of it shall be remembered in heaven, and you shall never be forgotten. The preacher is right. Under this sun, you will be forgotten. Me too. But if you submit your entire life and will to Christ, the Son of God, his promise is that he will never forget you. Life under this sun proves to have deep, eternal meaning, new meaning, each day. And so as we prepare to surround communion this morning, let me ask you, where are you at with this Son? Is he the Son who illuminates your path every day? Do you really think that you can find meaning apart from Him? Where are you at with Jesus Christ? And what is your next step? Perhaps you've wandered away. Perhaps you need to come back and begin that with some type of confession. Perhaps you've never started this journey because you doubted if He was real at all. Perhaps you need to believe and be baptized. What's your next step? I invite you to come see me during this communion time or afterwards if you see a next step for yourself. Would you please stand? We're going to read our communion scripture together.